Hey everyone, Rose here, and welcome back to another video. I actually wanted to get this video out a bit earlier than usual, but it ended up taking a bit longer to edit. But here it is. As I mentioned last week, I've been working on a bit of a bigger 3D project, and that's specifically the figurines for a board game. It's a fun little indie game called Dragon Royale. The Kickstarter isn't up yet, but I've linked the website in the description below, so if you're a fan of dragons and board games, definitely go check that out. So far I've made 3 figurines. I sadly didn't record the first 2, but I recorded the third one, so that's what this video is going to be about. The concepts are by Keymintt. I've linked her social media in the description below. She makes some really cool art, so definitely go check her out. In this time-lapse I'll be sharing my process on the character Dracul. I actually made 2 models for him, because I really liked how the design looked and I wanted to mess around with the transparent smoky bits, and that's not really something you can do in a solid figurine. So stick around to the end for both versions. I start out by adding a plane and merging it down onto one vertex. Then I add a skin modifier and a subdivision surface modifier, and extrude it out and look at it from different angles and use it to shape the spine. I found this approach very helpful for defining the flow and the overall pose of the model early on. I use Ctrl A to adjust the thickness, and then I add a second subdivision surface modifier before the skin modifier to smooth out the curve. Once I'm happy with the overall shape, I duplicate a piece and use that to shape the leg. Then I add a mirror modifier to the leg, as well as an empty object, and use the empty as the mirror object for the modifier. I duplicate this whole setup for the second pair of legs and later for the wings. Using empties like this makes it easier to define where exactly the object is mirrored. Now I add a sphere and use it to create the general shape of the ribcage, and I also duplicate it for the general idea of the head. Now I duplicate the front legs to make the wings, and make some adjustments there. And I edit the tail a little bit. I also take a piece of the wings and duplicate it over to make the horns. Here, instead of using an empty as a mirror object, I just used the head. I also use my skin modifier and mirror modifier setup to quickly make the hips. At this point I'm happy with how the overall shape is going, so I start adding smaller details, specifically the toes. They're still part of the same object as the front legs. I just duplicated some pieces and adjusted the thickness with Ctrl A. Sometimes when you duplicate a piece of mesh with a skin modifier, the skin modifier won't show up. If that happens, just select one end of the piece and go into your skin modifier and click Mark Root. Here I start working on the spines that are supposed to go all around his back, and I just use a skin modifier setup for those at first, but I don't really like how they look, so I end up redoing them. And here's where I redo them. I just add a simple object again and merge it down to one vertex, and then start extruding it all along the spine. I have snapping turned on and set to faces. Now I extrude the whole thing up with snapping turned off and start adjusting the shape and angle and stuff until it around about matches the reference. Now I take a step back from the spikes and go back to the head. I adjust some of the shape of the horns a bit, and then move on to the head. I duplicate the skull and add a lower jaw, and then start working on adding a bit more detail to both of them. For the sculpting on this model, I used a mix of dynamic topology and remeshing. Usually I almost only use remeshing, but for this model I found using dynamic topology was actually helpful in some situations. Most importantly, it allows you to make much more drastic changes to the model that would just stretch the mesh way too far otherwise. Like with most of my sculpts, I stuck to my main handful of brushes, that being the clay strips, the snake hook, and the crease brush, as well as using shift to smooth stuff out. I don't really do skeletal characters very often, so messing around with the shapes of the bones and stuff was really fun for this one. And now I move back to the wings for a while and specifically add the kind of fingery bits to those. Again, just by duplicating a piece of the existing mesh and moving it around a bit and adjusting the thickness. I also add a second bone to the forearm part of the wing because the reference has 2 bones there and actual arms also have 2 bones there. I also add the teeth, which is just a slightly adjusted cylinder that I move into place with a mirror modifier, again mirrored along the head. For the rest of the teeth, I just sculpt them into the skull. Now I finally go back to the spikes along the back. I adjust the angle of the edges so that they are leaning into the right direction, and I continue to adjust the shape until it matches the ref. Now everything looks about right, so I move on to the next step. I delete the top edges and then add another skin modifier and a subdivision surface modifier, and then select parts and adjust the thickness, and I move stuff around a bit until I'm happy with the shape. I add in a new object and copy the rotation and scale from the placeholder object. Then I add a mirror modifier, I turn on snapping and start snapping the vertices to the surface of my placeholder object. I also add a skin modifier again and a subdivision surface modifier, and just continue building up the ribs based around the placeholder object. And now they're pretty much done, so I go back to top view and adjust the overall shape of the spine and the tail. That way I can make sure that the overall model has a very nice flow to it. Now I go back to the limbs and start adding more details there. Similar to how I did with the wings, I add a second part to the forearms. I also use V to separate the object into different parts for the individual bones. I also mess around with the back legs at this point and separate out the hips and give them their own mirror object because I didn't really like how they were working out moving together with the legs. Now I go through the same process on the back legs as I did on the front legs, with separating stuff out into individual objects and adjusting the thickness and stuff like that. Now the whole thing is really taking shape and looking like a skeleton. But this dragon obviously isn't all skeleton. He also has this wispy, smoky, ghosty stuff all around him, so now I start working on that. I add in some new objects and duplicate some things like the spine, and move them around and scale them to kind of fill in the empty spaces between the bones where you would usually have the rest of the body. I don't think I've ever used the skin modifier as much as in this particular sculpt before. I used it a bit in the other dragons, but not as much as here. But it turns out it's actually really useful, except for the couple of glitches you get every once in a while, so I'll definitely be using it more in future sculpts. Now I duplicate a piece of the wing bones and apply all the modifiers and sculpt it into the wing shape. I use dynamic topology for this one, so that I can just pull everything out and stretch it without having to worry about running out of topology. I just duplicate the wing over and apply all modifiers again and adjust it so that it fits the shape of the other side. It took quite a while to get the wings exactly the way I wanted them. There had to be a proper balance between them looking kind of like bird wings, but also having this whole ghostly, smoky bit to them. So I messed around with that for quite a while, but eventually I got to something I really liked. It's around about at this point that I decided that I actually wanted two versions of the model, since I really liked how this whole transparency stuff was looking and I couldn't really mess around with it if I just had one version of the model. So rather than merging everything down and cleaning up and everything to make the final figurine, I hid the smoky bits and worked on detailing the skeleton a bit more. To start with, I just add some more subdivisions to the objects to make them a bit smoother. And then I add a couple of additional bones for detail that are also in the reference. Now I also apply all the modifiers on my horns and start sculpting in some of the details, starting with a crease brush to add in the creases, then inverting the crease brush by holding Ctrl to add in the sharper edges, and then pulling out bits with my snake hook brush. The whole process was quite quick. I was actually expecting this whole detailing part to take longer on the horns. I also work out a couple of more details on the skull and the jaw. At this point, I also finally sculpt in the remaining teeth. Now I repeat the detailing process from the big horns over on the small horns. Now I move back to the body, specifically the limbs, and start making major changes there too. I apply all the modifiers, again except for the mirror modifier, and also separate stuff out into separate objects, so that way I can now adjust the shape of bits like the shoulder blade away from just being like a weird sausagey bit onto actually having a shoulder blade shape. I also adjust some of the other bones in sculpt mode. For small things like the hands and feet, I didn't separate out the object into separate bits for different bones. I just sculpted those in sculpt mode. Now I apply all the modifiers on the main spine and sculpt in the individual vertebrae. Again, I just use the crease brush to just crease in the overall divides, and then go in with more of the crease brush as well as the clay strips brush and the smooth brush to work out the shapes until I'm happy with them. Now that I'm happy with the spine, I quickly apply the modifiers of the hip and add some detail there. At this point, I decide, since everything is in separate objects pretty much, I move the origins of the objects to about where the joint is, and then I parent all the objects together, so that way I essentially have a kind of rig, so I can pose the model more easily, which is really helpful at this point, so that the pose itself isn't so weirdly symmetrical. I also remove the mirror modifier and duplicate the model over and scale it on the x-axis to -1, so that I have a mirrored duplicate of the model on the other side, so that I can pose it without it being symmetrical. And I also use Ctrl-L to link the mirrored versions, so that way when I actually sculpt in some more details, they apply to both sides. With all that set up, I can now use it to adjust the pose, especially of the back legs, until I'm happy with how everything looks. Now I finally move to sculpt mode on the back legs to add a bit of extra detail. I also added kneecaps, which I had completely forgotten about up until now. Now I repeat the whole process for the wings as well, though I don't really need to pose them as much, so it wasn't really worth it. Now I add a couple more tweaks and finishing touches to the ribcage and try a couple of things out. And with a couple of final tweaks done, the skeleton is finally complete. This is also more or less the point where the two models split off, so I'll be showing you the process on the figurine first. For that, I turn the ghostly bits back on and essentially move them around so you can still see the bones, but at the same time the overall mesh is completely solid and feels like something that could be manufactured, and it doesn't have like holes or super thin loose parts all over the place. It was quite a challenge to get that to work and to look good especially, but eventually I came out with something I really liked. One thing I added that wasn't on the references was this flamey stuff around the back of the legs, just to give it more of this ghostly feel, because I felt that didn't really come across as well as I wanted in the solid model. Now I grab all the individual loose objects from the ghosty bits and merge them all into one solid thing. And I go in and add some more details and fix some more shapes and stuff in that until I'm happy with how it looks overall. And now that I'm happy with how all this looks, more or less, I finally merge all the objects together into one and remesh them. It took a few tries till I got everything right. A couple of pieces were kind of inverted and others didn't quite show up, but eventually I got everything into one mesh. And for the rest of this figurine sculpt, I essentially just went around making some things more sharper or more clear, making a couple of things thicker and thinner, so that in the end you can really recognize both the skeleton parts and the ghostly bits, and like the whole design kind of comes across in one solid piece without the transparency. And now with the final creases added and the final bit smoothed out, this version is finally done. I'm really happy with how this version turned out, and the rest of the team seems to really like him too. And with this one done, on to the next one. I started out with a save where I had already merged all the ghostly bits into one piece, but the skeleton was still separate. And now I essentially just go around moving all these ghostly bits around so that rather than having the bones stick out, they're all kind of inside the body. Except for some specific parts like the skull or the spikes on the back, which are on the outside normally. I didn't really pay much attention to the anatomy being super good or anything like that because of how the shaders were going to be later. The shapes really didn't have to be super accurate. I also messed around with inverting the normals for a while so that I could use backface culling, but I eventually turned them back around and just used shaders. As for the shaders, pretty much everything is based around a mix of an emission shader and a transparency shader. And then I also add some Fresnel as an input to essentially make the edges brighter and glowier and make the center way more transparent. And for the rest of the time I just mess around and switch around some values. For the bones, I just turned up the ambient occlusion quite far and then just made a white material with some brown ambient occlusion for the creases and joints. And from here I just mess around some more, add some noise textures and some gradient textures, just to add some variation and make it look a bit more interesting and not too flat and sterile. And eventually I'm done. This part didn't really take that long, just because I had already been building the original model in a way that I would pretty quickly be able to make this version. And with that, this version's done too. I just really liked how the design looked, and I felt it would be super fun to mess around with some weird, ghostly, transparent looking shaders. So I just made this one for fun. It's not going to show up in the game or anything probably. But yeah, it was really fun to make. Anyway, as I mentioned at the beginning, the design as well as the first figurine are for an indie game called Dragon Royale. Definitely go check the website out. As soon as the Kickstarter is out, I'll also link that in the description. And also check out Keymintt, who made the cool designs for this dragon as well as the others, as well as the intro pic I showed in the beginning. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Maybe you actually learned something new, that would also be great. If you did, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that, and join the Discord. You can share some of your own art or just hang out and chat. And with all that being said, that's all from me for today. See you all next time.